To the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age. Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages audio journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Cross Time Pub, swaggering like sages through the Seven Ages. And joining me as always are my fellows from the field, Jason Pentrail. Good day, sir.
Good day. I am way too caffeinated, but very happy to be here. It seems like it's been forever since we've been on the mic.
Highly caffeinated as always. And James Waldo, I hope you're drinking some of that delicious dark roast swamp sludge from down there in Savannah.
By the gallon. Yeah, good morning, fellas. It is good to be back. It's been a while.
It has been a while. And we're not talking about those annoying 90s songs that you hear on the radio from time to time. I mean, we've been spending time in the field together, and we've all survived. We're all still good friends. That's the most important part. And actually, a lot of people keeping up with what we're doing out there. I've been seeing more interactions, as you're going to hear in the donations segment a little bit later. I think it may have been Christmas here for Seven Ages, thanks to the diligence and the support of folks like you. More on that in a moment. But yeah, where have we been? What have we been doing? And what have we learned? Jason, we have been, I think, still processing all the information from Archaeological Excursion Spring 2019.
Oh, yeah, I would say so. You know, anytime we have the opportunity to get out there and take part in these excavations and do the road trips and shake hands and meet people, we always come home with a ton of information we have to process. We have our own personal experiences. We have the podcast. We have the photos, the videos, all the things that go along with, you know, being live in the field. But it's always a great time. You know, one of the biggest things about it is we always meet so many new people when we go to these excavations and these different events that when we get back, we have the opportunity to kind of start building those relationships along with all of the other things, and it adds more information because people's like, hey, you should, you know, talk to this person. You should look this. Have you ever read this book? And all of those things come into play when we're wrapping up one of these trips. So it's always fun. It's always entertaining, and we're already planning the next one. So
absolutely. Yeah, we're looking at a number of sites, but one in particular up in Illinois, well known to those who are fans of the Mississippian culture. And fellas, I hate to backtrack, but I've got to mention one more thing. So around this time of the year, it's a special time of the year for me because all kinds of things converge at once. So April 17th is not only mine, but my brother's birthday also. And it's right around that same time of the year, April 15th generally, that taxes are due. And then finally, at the end of April, I also have to usually go through the process of tuning up the vehicle, getting the vehicular inspection taken care of for the year in question, get my little sticker, put it on the license plate. So all these things going on, and it's just a maddeningly busy time of year, which makes it all the more enjoyable when a random package appears on my front doorstep, as it usually does around this time every year. And it's addressed from one Jason Pentrail of the sunken city of Relay. And I open it up, and there is fine, fresh, whole bean coffee from Charleston, the holy city, inside a box, along with a vintage magazine with a flying saucer on the front. So I want to thank you here, call you out in public for the wonderful birthday gifts. And I happen to be drinking some of that delicious dark roast, a Guatemalan coffee. Remind me again, what's the name of the roaster?
It's a fairly new roaster in Charleston called Springbok. Yeah. And I found them in a local coffee shop over in North Charleston, very near the Madrurua pub that we often frequent when you fellas are in town. And I just figured I'd give it a try, and come to find out it's really good coffee, which would explain why I'm so jittery and overly caffeinated right now.
Well, so you were drinking it too. I think you can probably tell by our inflections on the microphone that we've all been enjoying some of this coffee. So shout out to the Springbok folks down there in Charleston. Good stuff that you're producing. So why don't we lead off with something anomalous, fellas? James, you brought to our attention a geological mystery that occurred on an island, which I found highly interesting. And this is an unusual one that only I think geologists or those with some knowledge of geology would pick up on, because when you're walking out in the field, this happens to us all the time, we always find chunks of quartz. In fact, on one of the dig sites we were at, the 7 Ages team, and we should really tell the story in depth here a little later because I think it's kind of funny. It's one of those, Jason Pentrail is always the guy who can spot the lithics, and if I walk away and there's one right under my nose, 5 minutes later, Jason's still going to be the one that finds it. But we found a huge hunk of quartz of preform on one of the dig sites that we were working, and that's kind of nice. I felt like, the team really contributed something neat. But the broader point I'm making is that it's not unusual for us to find quartz when we're in the field working with our archaeologist friends. But when you find it on certain island formations out there in the ocean, that is extremely weird. James, geologist in residency here with us, would you like to explain why that's weird?
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting story. It's not interesting as I wanted it to be in the end, but I'll back up here. So there's a presumably volcanic island off the east coast of Africa. The island, at first glance, appears to have been formed volcanically, but a good portion of the island is actually made up of quartzite, which is not a volcanic material, it's kind of baffling, I guess, at first blush. And what quartzite is basically a sandstone or a rock that has a high silica content that has been metamorphosed by heat and pressure, probably through a mountain building process or something like that, and that's what forms quartzite. So the articles had made this out to be fairly mysterious, but after I read it, it became pretty obvious that it's really not that mysterious at all. The quartzite was previously existing before this volcanism happened in this local area. So now you've got this quartzite that's sort of mixed with this volcanic material, and it seems very strange, but it's one had to come before the other one. So the quartzite came first, and then the volcanism came later.
So in other words, what they thought that they'd found, this mysterious vein of quartz on this island, which should have been a volcanic formation, isn't that weird because this quartz pre-existed, and after the volcanic activity lifts the island and raises it out there as a prominence in the ocean, the quartz was merely brought up with the volcanic activity. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Huh. So there is, in fact, an explanation, as is usually the case when a little science is involved. Do I have a soundbite here somewhere? Some guy screaming science? That's what you're supposed to do when you figure out one of these all-time mysteries, right? Yeah, some guy screams, science! Guys, that reminds me of something. I was talking with our good friend and associate, Tim McMillan, yesterday, and he was talking about the fact that he gets the same guff from people. We tend to try and follow a logical process, and often we come across as complete skeptics or naysayers. And yes, I have, in truth, become much more skeptical over time as a result of trying to employ a logical process of thinking. But what's fascinating is if you look at the history, going back to the 1800s, if you look at the history of the forensic process and applying science to crime solving, there had been a time in England, for instance, where if there had been a crime committed, they'd bring in all the usual fellas, line them up and say, okay, who did it, and have the witnesses point and say who they thought it was. And then along comes Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and he creates the probably most famous detective of all time. Was not the creator of the detective story. That was actually Edgar Allan Poe, I believe, with Murders in the Rue Morgue. But no, we have Arthur Conan Doyle, who you might say refines the genre with the creation of Sherlock Holmes. And paraphrasing that famous statement he makes to Watson, you have to eliminate all that cannot be, and that which remains, however improbable it may seem, must be the truth. That was later borrowed by another famous logician, a fellow known as Spock in the Star Trek universe. But again, that idea of saying, eliminate what is impossible and follow this deductive logic. The public response from reading those Holmes stories had been that people actually wanted, like the fictional character, they wanted science applied to forensic analysis or the creation of forensic analysis as a result of these stories. And what they saw Holmes, who was this wonderful chemist, and he had all these incredible knacks for getting information and things like this, there was this process that he went through. People wanted to see more of that in actual crime solving. And this actually gave birth to forensic science, essentially as we know it today. I always found that kind of interesting in the sense that a fictional creation, a character with brilliant logical capabilities leads to a new branch of science. But that said, if you apply logic, what you will learn, like Sherlock Holmes, and the funny thing is he too was, again, just this traditional perennial skeptic. Unlike Doyle, who was all into spiritualism, he believed in fairies and things like this, mediumship, all these kinds of things that these days you wouldn't generally append much credit to in terms of their existence. But nonetheless, his fictional creation was very much the skeptic. And I think in real life, if you attempt to try and apply that same kind of logic, it will tend to make you more skeptical. So Tim said that too, like with regard to the story you're talking about there, James. There's usually a logical explanation, even if it seems extraordinary. And Tim said, I'm always getting guff from people because they think I'm just no fun. I'm always breaking down the things. And he will tell you, my intention is not to be a skeptic all the time, but instead merely to try and find the truth, which is actually an advocacy of that quest for knowledge that we're all on. So, again, when you find a geological mystery like that, fun though it may seem, of course, in the end, there usually is a logical explanation. And Jason, I know when it comes to both the archaeological and also the historical work that we do, you employ a lot of that, especially as it relates to our ongoing interest in that period of time where contact occurs first between Europe and the New World. We did our 2-part American Holocaust episode on that. And as you have brought to my attention, apparently there has been an update with regard to that, Jason.
Yes, indeed. And this was brought to my attention initially by our friend and listener, Dan Newbanks. Basically, what's going on is Mexico has demanded an apology from Spain in reference to, the conquering of the country and the massacre that happened. And I told Dan, I said, I'd rather comment about this on the podcast rather than get involved in a flame war and all this, conversation through social media. I don't involve myself in those type of things, and I didn't want to start. So I figured I would just address it here, being that we recently wrapped up our 2-part series that you mentioned on the American Holocaust. This is a good follow-up to that. So essentially what we have here is Mexico's president sent a letter to Spain's King Felipe VI, along with Pope Francis, urging them to apologize for the human rights abuses that we've discussed that were committed during the conquest in the region, well over 500 years ago. President Obrador of Mexico said that the indigenous people of Mexico have been victims of massacres, which we know to be the case. That's obvious. He was speaking in the ruins of an ancient city, and he called for a full account of the abuses. Spain quickly rejected his call and called for what they termed a constructive perspective instead. Now, there's a couple things we need to unpack here. I'm going to keep it brief, but to give a little bit of background, essentially, why does Mexico want an apology now in 2019? Well, it basically comes from President Obrador, who is the first leftist president in Mexico in over 7 decades. He's been pursuing what some people would call a radical agenda. He was sworn in December. He's promising to take on corruption and reduce inequality, addressing the big problems with poverty in Mexico. So there's a lot of things that he's trying to do, all of which are noble causes. But again, we get back to the heart of the matter here. He's calling for an apology. And to quote exactly what he said, he says, "I have sent a letter to the Spanish king and another letter to the Pope so that the abuses can be acknowledged and an apology can be made to the indigenous peoples for the violations of what we now call human rights. There were massacres. The so-called conquest was done with the sword and the cross. They raised churches on top of temples. The time has come to reconcile, but first they should ask for forgiveness." So there's a couple things there, and we kind of addressed some of this in episode 1 of the American Holocaust podcast with Daniele Bolelli. And I think Daniele really captured the importance here. First of all, should there be an apology? Well, of course, that's subjective. Everybody has their own opinion on that. Being that I was asked specifically for my opinion, I will tell you that I don't think an apology is necessary, nor do I think it really serves much of a purpose in 2019. As we discussed in episode 1 of the American Holocaust podcast, we can't apologize for things that we weren't involved with directly. So, the modern Spanish population, they didn't do the murdering and the conquering, and they weren't involved with that. And we would have to go back in time many, many generations to find anybody who was. So ultimately, I don't see the need for an apology. You know, I wouldn't apologize for something someone else in my family did to someone because I'm not the one that was responsible for it. However, I think the second part of his request is where we need to focus, which is acknowledgement. By acknowledging such tragedies, that's where we can draw a lesson from. That's where we can learn from our past. We can't deny it. We can't act like it didn't happen, but we can begin to focus on this is what happened, this is why it happened, and this is how we can avoid it happening in the future. So the acknowledgement part is important. Now, if they wanted to come to an agreement for building of memorials or building of museums or things to capture what happened there, that's perfectly fine. I don't see the need for an apology. I do, however, just as we see here in North America, the acknowledging of what happened is the most important part.
Jason, I agree 100% with you. There's no apology needed, like Daniele was talking about. It's sort of, if you apologize for something that you didn't do, it's sort of like a false admission of guilt for something, in a way, So I don't think you should apologize for something you weren't personally involved in. But sober acknowledgement, absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the most important parts, and public education.
It's kind of a mixed bag. I'll say this. I guess I'll be the outlier. An apology may do some good, but to me, I think that the request for the apology is actually, in many ways, the request for the acknowledgement that you're talking about, James. In other words, by acknowledging, the atrocities that occurred centuries ago, and this, again, something that was in large part carried out by Spain, but thereafter there were many Europeans and people from other parts of the world that came here. And this gravely affected the indigenous population in North and South America. Again, it seems that the end result is an acknowledgement that, hey, there were some problems and that, we need to understand this. We understand it so that it never happens again. But again, to me, that process comes back around. And again, if an apology initiates that acknowledgement, in any case, what I hope for, putting all politics aside, logically, what I hope for is that there will be historical awareness and recognition through education. This is the most important thing, and this is, again, what many historians would argue. This is fundamentally the reason why we study history. We don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past, and we also want to understand where we came from, which many would say helps us not repeat the mistakes of the past. I think that, in truth, that's a kind of a bleak outlook to have in terms of history. And for my own part, I would like to think that we glean more from history than just all the horrible things that we've done in the past and how we don't do those again. But that is definitely an important aspect of the process of historical inquiry. But I think that, again, in understanding the atrocities and acknowledging them, if indeed an apology is the way that you reach that acknowledgement, hey, that's all well and good. But I would say this, and this part of it coming over onto the side that I think that you guys are arguing, in my personal practical opinion, stepping over onto the practical partition of the old thinking hard drive here, to me, I wonder really in the long term what good that does. Acknowledgement and apologies centuries after it happened may be necessary for some people in some instances when we have atrocities on this level. But again, on a practical level, what does that really do? Once again, what I feel I would like to see more of is historical recognition, scholarly efforts to educate the broader public on it. And that's really fundamentally the reason that we did the American Holocaust episode, to try and bring awareness to this issue. I won't lie, I'm going to put it out here for everybody to hear too. Those episodes, got about as much in terms of traffic and downloads as any other episode that we would have put out. But we noticed that they got fewer shares on social media. And that's part of the problem to me. There seems to be this kind of attitude where people are like, oh, that's interesting, and we just don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. No, we need to. It's not the kind of thing you want to embrace. I was talking with a friend last night about it, and she said, wow, this conversation kind of got dark. Well, people don't want to have it thrown in their face all the time, the horrible things that happened in our history, but we have to acknowledge them. And maybe the first place it should be acknowledged, rather than publicly or internationally, maybe the first place it should be acknowledged is on a personal level. We challenge ourselves to understand the past better so that we know where we come from, who our ancestors were, what was happening in the past. And we can understand, really, I think, in what many would call dark times in the modern era, which I think is silly because, again, if you look at the past and how bad things have been, things are really great right now in most ways. And to me, that kind of puts you in a better mindset for seeing all the good things that you have in the world in front of you today. To know the past is to appreciate the present and to look to the future with a brighter, more positive outlook. So again, all these things are important, I think, with history, but maybe that personal acknowledgement is the first thing that we should do.
Well, on that note, it's interesting to see how the Spanish government, responded to this request. And Madrid promptly rejected the request of President Obrador for an apology, stating, "The arrival 500 years ago of Spaniards to present Mexican territory cannot be judged in the light of contemporary considerations. Our two brother nations have always known how to read our shared past without anger, with a constructive perspective." There was no immediate comment from the Vatican, but 3 years ago on a visit to Mexico, Pope Francis asked indigenous people for forgiveness over the way they had been excluded from society. So he talks about, them being excluded from modern Mexico, but again, not addressing the initial conquering of the country. And, again, I don't want to go too far into this, but I will say that a lot of this is about not only the acknowledgement, but about the attitude that we carry about certain things. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that in the social media posting of this, there was one person who decided to argue that the conquering in the way that it was done was indeed a wonderful thing because it brought Mexico all of the modern societal things that they have today. So he looked at it as, hey, we helped you out by bringing you into the modern world, which I kind of found disgusting, quite honestly.
It's silly. That is ridiculous. Again, this is the problem to me when people don't really understand history or they have a very skewed perspective on it based on what kinds of literature they may have read. And this is something Daniele Bolelli kind of said. Should we judge past actions by the standards of today? Should we hold people today accountable who actually were not complicit in actions that occurred? Again, last time I checked, it wasn't me or Jason or James or Daniele Bolelli or Dr. Samuel Zenner, or Tara Hauska, who 500 years ago had these experiences. But we absolutely have to deal with and understand these things today. The way that we do that is through proper education. And interestingly, despite the two aforementioned scholars I mentioned, we actually talked about, getting updated, accurate historical information into schools, more with Tara Hauska, who is an attorney and an activist. But, she, being a member of the First Nations people of North America, again, she, I think, is hyper aware of this and having seen the kinds of things in the textbooks. It's important that we get accurate, up-to-date, and I think unbiased information in books so that people don't go on social media and say, it was actually great. Look how well you guys turned out. Well, no, if you knew history, you wouldn't say that. Frankly, that's a stupid thing to say. My 2 cents. There you go.
No, I agree completely.
So, maybe shifting gears here for a moment, I want to touch on something, a fantastic discovery about an early human ancestor and one that remains quite enigmatic and mysterious. There's even some debate about the pronunciation of the name. I'm going to use the more popular pronunciation from here in North America. That would be Denisovan. But as you pointed out prior to the program, Jason, again, in other parts of the world, some people say Denisovan. My dad actually said Denisovan on the telephone the other day. And since I've recently been narrating audiobooks, I found a wonderful resource online, a website that allows you to go through and find different multiple pronunciations of things, and you can kind of find out what the most common version is. Again, in my estimation, more scholars, for instance, if you have a term like Neanderthal, some people dispute that one too and say, don't ever say Neanderthal. But actually, I hear more scholars use that apparently preferentially over Neanderthal. In the same way, I see more people say Denisovan rather than Denisovan. But again, I guess they're always going to be those who would argue the other way. The important thing about it is that there has been a new confirmation, and this news is a little late in arrival here on the podcast with all the travel and stuff we've been doing. So this dates back to early March. And in fact, we intended to get to it on a previous episode and just didn't have time. Scientists, however, have confirmed the discovery of the first ever Denisovan skull fragments. And this is interesting and important because, as some of you may recall who have been following this, what we had prior to this was merely a giant tooth. And I say giant tooth merely because it was a fairly large, actually there were more than one tooth that were recovered, but some of them were very large. And generally, when we're talking about primates, that is probably going to be a pretty good indication that this was a large individual, not just a normal-sized person with a really big mouth and or teeth. So some estimates actually indicate that the Denisovans may be 6 to 7 feet tall. Some of them. That doesn't necessarily mean all of them, but some of them may have been quite large. And we also had a fingertip from which DNA was extracted, but in the DNA extraction process, that fingertip was destroyed. And so prior to this, that was just about all that we had about these mysterious ancient hominids. But, as reported at Science Alert, a chunk of Denisovan skull has been identified for the first time, a dramatic contribution to the handful of known samples from one of the most obscure branches of the hominin family tree. Paleoanthropologist Bense Viola from the University of Toronto will discuss the as-yet unpublished discovery in an upcoming meeting of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists in Cleveland, Ohio, at the end of March. Now, very little is known about the Denisovans, an extinct branch of hominins, the report reads, that was a sister group to Neanderthals. Only 4 individual Denisovans had been identified previously, all from one cave in Siberia. And, what else they found in that cave? They found this very intricately worked bracelet. There were also remains of an extinct horse, a European horse, which, again, found relatively in situ near the remains of these individuals from the cave, which some interpreted as being evidence that they may have actually domesticated these animals. Now, that's, again, a fairly speculative assertion. We don't know if indeed that was the case. But what I would definitely say about the Denisovans is that we have a very unique case here where ancient human ancestors, perhaps fairly large, as many of the robust hominids were. That's not particularly unusual for those who think, wow, 7 feet tall, these guys were Bigfoot. No, in truth, you see that with Paranthropus, you see that with Homo heidelbergensis, you see that with a lot of the extinct hominid species. But what is fascinating on the subject of Bigfoot is that, among those hopeful believers in the existence of a creature like that, many, and this goes back to the late anthropologist Grover Krantz, they had proposed that perhaps this creature, if it exists, and again, we'd need a lot of physical evidence to be able to prove something like that, but for the sake of discussion, if it existed, it might have been something that descended from an extinct giant ape species known as Gigantopithecus. And up until the discovery of these skull fragments of the Denisovans, there had not been as much evidence, I think, for these extinct hominids in the form of the teeth and the fingertip that had been found there in Denisova Cave. There had been less material evidence that gave us indications of what these hominids were like than there had been previously for Gigantopithecus, because there was an entire jaw fragment along with teeth, which that doesn't sound like much more, but it can actually tell you an awful lot. As Grover Krantz and others have pointed out, that shape of the jaw can tell you generally whether or not there was space for the larynx and whether or not the creature may have actually been an upright or bipedal walking creature. There's still a lot of debate about that, whether creatures like Gigantopithecus were bipedal or whether they were knuckle walkers like some of the great apes of today. But the point being that, again, there are some very mysterious ancient apes that are known to exist, and we actually had less information about the Denisovans until recently. Now we have skull fragments, and as we're assembling this picture, we're learning more and more about these folks. But again, they seem to have been very intelligent. Some of them may have been very large, and of course there is at least some remnant DNA from these ancient ancestors in human populations that exist today. So I just love the broader discussion of primatology, anthropology, and the study of our ancient past, paleontologically and also in terms of where we came from. Fascinating stuff, guys. James?
Yeah, what's interesting to me about this is some of these other, human family members that we had, they coexisted with humans as early as 30,000 years ago, which geologically speaking is a few minutes ago, really. So, the Denisovans coexisted with human beings in the last ice age.
Yeah, and there was another new discovery recently. We have existing but fairly recent discoveries like that of Homo floresiensis, and then, of course, also we have the Red Deer Cave people from China, which those are some of the most interesting ones to me because these have been identified as a distinctly different group of Homo, and yet one which existed maybe as recently as 13,000 years ago. That would be contemporaneous with the North American Clovis culture. And so a lot of these things point to, I guess, maybe the potential for radical shifts in the way that we view human ancestry, and again, how some of our hominid cousins, how recently some of them may have existed in our midst. And that, to me, is indeed fascinating. It's like you said, Jason, from time to time you make these discoveries. It seems like almost every other week one turns up, and we're indeed extending the branches on the family tree.
And something else that keeps popping up in our community is people named Chris. So, kind of a little running joke, but while we were out on these last 2 excavations in South Carolina, we had 5 members of our listening audience and also our friends that we've got to know over the last couple of years, all named Chris, and they were all gathered in one place at one time. So it got a bit interesting with the names. But that leads to this week. We have a email from yet another Chris, this time Chris Campbell, who writes, "Hello, Jason. My name is Chris, and I'm a big fan of the podcast you, James, and Micah have put together. I've been a listener since the first episode. You fellas have done a jam-up job of making an excellent podcast out of a subject that I feel does not get enough time in the spotlight. Anyway, the reason I'm reaching out is not to be a gushing fan, but to ask you and the other guys if you've heard of this Musconetcong River site in Warren County, New Jersey. I've read that it's perhaps the second oldest continuously inhabited site in the country, going back as far as 11,000 to 13,000 years, and apparently it's 5 minutes down the road from me. I haven't been able to find many details, as it seems the majority of the information on the site is kept from the public for conservation reasons. I can't say that I disagree with that viewpoint, and this is where I was hoping you guys could help. I'd love to know more about the site. I'd love to see it get the attention from the archaeological community that it deserves. I hope that you guys could look into it and maybe reach out to whoever the experts are on the site and maybe make an episode out of it. Or hell, maybe you guys can go full topper on it. I know it's a bit north for you, but it's still part of the Appalachians, and if that motivates Micah a bit, here's a link I found to a geological report that mentions it. So yeah, Chris, again, thank you for reaching out. I read the geological report. It's actually very interesting, and that entire valley, come to find out, is quite extensive and has a very, like you mentioned in the email, a very long history going all the way back to the Paleo times, all the way up until the woodland period. So yeah, there's a lot of archaeology there. I have found a few other sources on it, but I'm going to dig a little bit deeper, and we may be able to come up with something a little bit more definitive.
Well, there are so many sites like that out there that don't get the kind of attention maybe that they need. Some sites probably need less attention because there's the ever-present problem of looting. And there are many archaeologists who would say that they don't want attention brought to sites like this. But, of course, that doesn't seem to be the case here. I want to thank Chris, of course, for taking time to write in and share information with us about that. And definitely we would love to hear from you. If you are out there and you would like to write an email to us, it's simple. There are 3 emails to remember. Very easy to remember, too. It's our names, Jason, James, or Micah, M-I-C-A-H, at 7ages.org. So just pop our name right there in the front of at 7ages.org, and you can write an email to any of us. Follow us online to at 7ages on Twitter. You can find 7ages Research on Facebook, Instagram, and, of course, on our YouTube channel. Coming up on, I think, 9,000 views of our topper video. So thanks for all the support that you guys send along in all the ways that you do, and especially those of you who have pledged support through donations. We have a donation button over there at 7ages.org where you can make a donation using a credit card or through PayPal. And keep in mind, we aren't lining our pockets with the untold amounts that are coming in. Generally, this goes back into funding our research, because when we're out there and we're traveling, even when we're going down and assisting on the archaeological sites, we have to be able to pay for lodging, and this is coming out of pocket, typically. So your support goes toward the furtherance of our research and, of course, hosting fees and also the other endeavors that are behind the scenes with regard just to the media side of what we do. And so a few of you guys have shown support recently, and that means so very much to us. And I want to start off with a fella who said he didn't want to be mentioned, but Chris Corley, I'm calling you out, because he said, this is for you guys. You're my brothers. He sends along $50, and he said, you don't have to mention me on the show, but we got to mention you, man, because, again, everything that you do for us, with us, I mean, it means so much. Chris is one of the most talented avocationalists that I have met. And so much of the stuff that Jason and I, when we initially kind of started, and we brought Waldo up with us, and we decided we were going to get out and start working the creeks and try and, utilize the hobby diver license to try and find information about where certain point types are most prevalent, and then give that information back to our friends in the University of South Carolina educational system, like Dr. Al Goodyear, Chris Moore, and others. Those kind of things that we hope to do, Chris is already doing. He is keeping very data-oriented information about what he finds, where he finds it, and he's sharing that information with academics. And by the time we get down there to the White Pond site, he's already on site volunteering along with Dan Newbanks and others. And so that's one truly wonderful thing, I think, is that, through our efforts to try and work more with archaeologists, there are other very talented avocationalists and professionals who are coming into the field with us, the ever-extending branches of the research associates. And so, Chris, thank you so much for continuing to show your support for what we do. We support you, and thank you so much for what you do for us with us, and actually out there in the field with our companions in archaeology. We also have Designs Unlimited vinyl lettering and graphics, who sends along $100. It's Christmas, boys. And they said, love it, keep up the good work. Thank you so much. And then also we've got a couple of subscriptions. Christina Frawley at the $10 subscription level monthly. And that's not all, because my longtime pal Tony Click sends along $7 too. So bam, that's at least enough to buy a couple of gin and perhaps some lodging on the next outing. What do you think?
Yeah, it's great, man. Definitely some gas money for sure.
That's right. Yeah. Don't even include gas money and cost of transportation. And, as we're extending out further into the field, there was some discussion yesterday, Jason and I talking about, booking flights to be able to get to some of these locations, in which case you'd have to rent a vehicle. Yeah, that stuff is not inexpensive, but it's important to us to convey accurate and logical information about our past and to network with professionals who are the best equipped at providing that information to the populace. We want to be a channel and a medium for them. And when you guys support our work, it helps the furtherance of their work. We want to bring good information to the masses as it relates to archaeology, history, science, and culture. So, without further ado, fellows, it's now time for us to get to the interview portion of the podcast. While we were in the field recently, we did some of our very first live in the field podcasts and before a live audience. And what is about to ensue was truly one of the most enjoyable conversations from that stint in the field. Dr. Shane Miller joins us from Mississippi State University, and he was excavating a site in South Carolina he's going to tell you all about once we return right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. Live in the field and testing some new audio equipment, Jason Pentrail and yours truly, Micah Hanks. And we are joined right now by Dr. Shane Miller, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at MSU. How are you doing, my man?
I'm doing all right. This is my first podcast experience, and this is pretty awesome.
Kind of a first for the swag site, also adjacent to the Topper site, and on a rather clandestine property. Why don't we lead off right there? Where exactly are we? We had to be blindfolded before we were even brought in here.
So I'm going to paint a mental picture for everybody. We're sitting at a picnic table, and behind Jason and Micah are a cast of grad students who, at the drop of a hat, will kidnap these two and disappear them.
I think we can also say this is our first live studio audience. Are you guys alive back there, by the way?
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, man, I had them all set up to be like these ninjas protecting the site. And the reality, I think we just blew that. So.
Yeah, blown our cover.
Yeah.
It is quite a fortified installation out here, though, again, on chemical plant property, which is advantageous in a lot of ways because, again, we have precious archaeological heritage dating back thousands of years that is at stake, and so there's a bit of protection that's added, and also, again, a general security for people who are coming and going. And there's, I guess throughout several dig seasons, there are several different operations annually that are occurring here archaeologically.
So this place is, it's run by Archroma, which is a multinational corporation who actually is really supportive of archaeology. And so they have a huge chunk of land out in the middle of nowhere, South Carolina. And it's really nice as an archaeologist to be able to have access to this property because they have this we're sitting in a wonderful picnic shelter that they use for their yearly annual picnic. And so they let archaeologists use it. They've been letting archaeologists use it since the 80s. And the other nice thing about it is in a lot of cases, archaeologists have to worry about site security. And we really don't necessarily have to worry about that here because you have to come in through the plant, through a guard shack. We always provide tons of information so they know whenever we come out exactly who's coming out, the names, the cars, all that kind of stuff. So whenever anybody else comes out here trying to even find the site, we'll get a phone call and they'll be like, hey, who is this person? Are they with you? And we can verify, or in a lot of cases say sometimes we're like, we have no idea who this person is, and they're not allowed past the guard shack. So it's actually a great environment, a great campground area, great archaeology, and also great site security, which is like a really rare combo in North America anymore.
Really is.
Yeah, well, it sets up a perfect situation, I would say. And the heritage and tradition of sites that are found here is remarkable. So how many sites are actually located on this property?
Oh, man, a lot. So I think you could make a case that this entire property is probably one continuous lithic scatter. So if you are trying to actually identify sites, this is a great theoretical question about what exactly we mean by archaeological site, because it's harder when you're shovel testing out here. It's harder to find a negative shovel test than a positive shovel test. There is just stuff everywhere.
Yeah, which is a good problem to have in some cases, but it's not always the best thing, right?
Yeah. So the issue out here is you have to be really judicious about where you dig and how much you dig, because if you, I'll give you an example. So we were doing a survey out here in 2016, and we were trying to figure out what the extent was, and that's when we also just figured out how hard it was to find a negative shovel test. And we ran into an area that was a cobble field. It was just every shovel test we just got into it, and it was just backpacks full of rocks. And I was like, okay, I think we've covered that there's archaeology here. I don't think we need to put this in boxes in a facility. We're just going to draw a big polygon around this and just say lots of stuff and just end it right there. And so, I mean, really, there's the curation side of it. In a lot of places, people struggle to find stuff, and you might have an entire field season and you might fill 1 or 2 boxes. Where with us, it's, within a week or two, if you're not careful, you could fill a U-Haul truck. So,
I mean, there's a lot going on up here. Now, for those in the audience who are the dedicated amateurs, let's discuss really quickly a shovel test. What does that entail, and what does it perform in the broader context of the archaeology you do here?
So the standard shovel test is anywhere 30 to 50 centimeters in diameter, and sometimes goes upwards of a meter deep in some contexts, not very deep at all, in some cases fairly deep. And the reason, it really depends on where you're digging and what the probability is of something being very deep. And so usually you run out there with your shovel and your screen on some kind of interval, 15, 20, 30 meter intervals, and you're basically putting a hole in the ground and seeing if anything's in there. So whenever I say positive, it means that there's an artifact in it. Negative means there's not an artifact in it. And so it really varies by state. It varies by project. It varies by what certain stakeholders really are looking for.
And now you have a long history at this site. You've been here for many years on different projects. So give us a little bit of your history concerning the Topper site and everywhere up to the Swag site now.
So my history with this place is in some ways a complete random accident. I was a master's student at the University of Tennessee, and I was initially going to do a rock shelter survey on a part of the Cumberland Plateau, looking for the types of sites that would yield evidence for early plant domestication. So there's kind of Cumberland Plateau is a hot spot for that. So I was all hot to trot to do that. And then I took David Anderson's Peopling of the Americas class my first semester of grad school. He had just gotten to UT, and he was teaching this class, and it was awesome. And he needed somebody who had some web page skills to transfer the PIBA database from Florida State to Tennessee whenever he moved from Tallahassee to Knoxville. So I was the kid in the class who knew a little bit about HTML code. So I made the web page. And so that was actually my class project for that class. And so he hired me the next semester with some of his startup funds to really help organize all the work study students that he had. And then I just so happened to be in his office one day when Al Goodyear called. So keep in mind, that semester, when we were taking Peopling of the Americas, is when Al had one of his press conferences saying that there was 50,000-year-old man in the New World when we were taking Peopling of the Americas. So it was a really kind of cool time to be taking a class on Paleoindians. And so it was a really neat experience. And so that next semester working for Dave, I was in his office one day and Al Goodyear called. And Dave really likes to get famous archaeologists on the phone, then unwittingly turn speakerphone capability on, and then put his graduate students on the spot to talk to famous archaeologists. And it's like, I don't know what to say. I was totally starstruck. And then Dave and Al were talking, and they were like, they needed some grad students to come down because they had found the Clovis area on the hillside of the Topper site, and he was looking for grad students who would be interested in come working. So that was how I ended up here. So complete accident. And then once I got out here, I just kept coming back over and over again.
And still here today. And part of that legacy, by the way, because we were there at the 45th annual conference with Southeastern Archaeology, and there was David Anderson giving his talk, and he featured a photograph of you as a grad student at Topper. So many years later, here we are with, again, Dr. Shane, and he's out there still working, but now he's teaching grad students. Does he put you guys on speakerphone with David Anderson and Al Goodyear? Oh, wait, Al Goodyear showed up today because Al Goodyear also keeps coming back out to this site. And again, that's one of the true joys. We never know what we're going to encounter. Jason, here we are helping Shane. Tomorrow, we're heading over to another location to assist Dr. Christopher Moore, and we're going to our car at one point, I think, to refill our coffee. And we see this familiar figure walking down the dirt road in our direction, and sure enough, there's Al Goodyear. Hey, boys! He kind of, I think he may be capable of maybe multi-dimensional travel or something. He can open like a wormhole and just appear at will or something. He's kind of like Gandalf. A wizard comes and goes as he pleases. That's Al Goodyear, and I don't think we would dispute anybody here that he is indeed a wizard. But I tell you, you learn so much from people like Al Goodyear. What was it like training in the field in the shadow of greatness that is Dr. Goodyear?
Oh, man. So there are so many Goodyear stories, and I don't know where to start. The one thing I really liked about out here and the way that Goodyear kind of treated us as grad students, he threw us to the wolves when it came to public outreach, public interaction. It was like, all right, you've got a crew of 10 to 15. I think one of my master's thesis, at one point I had 30 people working under me on an excavation block as like a 23, 24-year-old grad student that eventually became my master's thesis. So you just like had to figure it out. And it's like, you need to figure out how to manage people. You need to figure out how to work with personalities. You need to figure out how to get a bunch of people going in one direction all at once. And you better figure out a way to make it interesting, because there are a lot of mosquitoes out here. It's really, really hot. And these people are out here excited about archaeology. You don't need to be the one that makes it suck. So you better show up and bring it. And Goodyear made it exciting. And so it was also nice that Dave was right up the road in Williston part of the year. And so he was always popping. And it really made you feel like, for Paleoindian archaeology, that you were kind of in the center of the universe here in the Southeast. And it really made that a lot of fun. It really made you feel like you were part of something special, which was really nice.
Oh, absolutely. I would say that Al Goodyear, no archaeologist on site could make this job suck, because the cottonmouths do that already.
Yeah, true.
There's plenty about this region that does that for us. But again, to me, this is one of the most remarkable areas in the Southeast for archaeology, because again, you have so much represented. There have been woodland sites. Again, Topper is very controversial because it pushes the boundaries of what we think could be in North America. And of course, it remains controversial because not everyone in the archaeological community is on board with what we believe is found there. And then we have sites like Swag, which you are overseeing right now with this fine group of dedicated professionals. So let's talk a little bit about Swag.
All right. So one of the things that when I was a grad student and we were working at Topper, we'd always wonder, kind of like, there's that meme of Buzz Lightyear, and his hands is up in the air and he's like, out there. And we were always wondering, like, what is out there? And because other than Goodyear and Charles, their initial survey of the chert quarries, there's this huge property that's relatively untouched. It's not like the type of place that's been vacuumed clean of archaeology, like a lot of places in the Southeast. And so we were like, what's out there? And so finally, when I ended up at Mississippi State, one of the things that we do is we have a survey field school that trains people for experiences in CRM. And so I, show up and they're like, you need to run a survey field school. What are you going to do? And I was like, I know exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to see what's out there at Topper. And so it was a great kind of experience because I could also keep it, because of this facility, I could keep it kind of cheap for students. And so I was like, let's roll. Let's go out and let's go to all these areas that we wanted to put holes in the ground for years. Let's go. And so in the course of doing that, one of the sites that Al recorded was the swag site, which it's not me trying to be cool and name it something that like some
but it
kind
is a cool
of
name.
cool millennial name, like the swag site. I guess
they like the name.
Yeah, they're thanks, guys. The peanut gallery in the back is all like, yeah, you're trying to be cool, Dr. Miller.
And succeeding with gusto.
So I think it's the name comes from like instead of saying a swale, they use the word swag. And so, or at least that's what they claim. And so it's kind of like this bowl that's looks like for all the world like a Carolina Bay that's been nicked on one side by the Savannah River, so the bay is kind of drained out. And just by doing shovel testing on intervals and kind of laying a grid out and actually digging that way instead of kind of going to the obvious spots where people would be, we went, put holes in places that might not be so obvious. And we put a shovel test in that produced a bunch of really big tools and overshot flakes and the kind of stuff that we would find at the Clovis component at Topper. And so my colleague Derek Anderson was the one who was like, actually like when we brought the bags in, he was pulling out the bags and he was like, oh my God, here's a big tool. Here's a big tool. Here's an overshot flake. Here's an overshot flake. Here's another big tool. And he just looked up at me. He goes, we're digging here, man. We're going here. And so that's what we did. The next year we did an excavation field school, and we've been slowly working through this excavation block in a place where Al Goodyear today was like, this shouldn't be here. We have no idea why it's there, but we have 2 1x1s that are the 2 densest 1x1s that have ever been excavated out here. Hunter Saunders is right over here. He was actually in the field school.
Yeah.
And when he was trying to map it, he would just sit there and stare at the unit. And he was like, there is so much stuff in here. I don't even know how to even begin tackling something like this.
I mean, it's dense. Really quickly, by the way, before we proceed, 3 things maybe we should kind of touch on. One, you mentioned the sites in the Carolina Bay. Mm-hmm. Jason, we talk about Carolina Bays often on the show. We know how divided opinions are on the formation of these bays. I actually think everybody here present is in the camp that we understand that these are lake formations, lacustrine formations, natural. There is some conjecture that they are impact features of some kind. Really quickly, let's talk about what a Carolina Bay is and the significance of the fact that this unique, I'll stop short of calling it anomalous, but it is unique. But, let's talk about the significance of its location in a Carolina Bay and what that is.
So, you want to explain what a Carolina Bay is?
Please.
So they're kind of like these upland ponds. And you can think of a good metaphor. They're like a sand bowl, if you will. And the bottom of it, there's a clay formation. And so what that does is perches the water table. And so whenever the water table's up, it'll kind of scour the shoreline. And then when the water table drops, the beaches are exposed and the wind will start blowing the sands up on these dunes that are basically around the rim of the Carolina Bays. So they're like these upland ponds surrounded by these sand rims. And so Chris Moore, not too far from here, has been having a lot of luck digging on the rims of these Carolina Bays. And on the rim of the one that is around Swag, we actually found some sites, including one that has like a preform with overshot flaking that looks for all the world like a Clovis preform.
So you have found some sites along the river.
Yes, yeah.
Wow, okay.
And so it was really bizarre to find one down in the bottom because it should be a pond, but on one side of it, there's it almost looks like a Western arroyo cut, probably where this thing was drained out. So we don't exactly know when it was drained out. We don't know exactly what it would have looked like during Paleoindian times, but it's kind of a mystery, and that's kind of what we're out here exploring.
But there's the possibility it could have been dry, like we were talking about today.
Yeah, I mean, that's always a possibility. And there's so many of these things scattered up the eastern seaboard. Each one kind of takes on its own identity, and a lot of times housing communities, strip malls, different things have been built into these, and people aren't even aware that they're even part of it. You know what I mean? So there's literally thousands of them up and down the eastern seaboard. So these things are very prevalent. But
somebody built a Dollar Tree and they found out.
Who knows? Your house could be in a Dollar Tree as well.
What's
right?
under your home?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm in a Carolina Bay. There you go.
This is right. So, but more importantly, talking about the swag site here, people are familiar with a quarry site. So, some of the ones that come to mind that are kind of famous, you have Flint Ridge up in Ohio, you have the Urari Morrow Mountain Quarry up in North Carolina. From what I've seen here, being here twice now, and you can certainly attest to this more than me, as far as density and the amount of material, I would put this up against any of those quarry sites. How do you feel about that statement?
Absolutely. It is thick here. It's daunting in a lot of ways to work here, and it really makes you, like I said earlier, it makes you really judicious about where you put in a hole and how much time you spend excavating it. So going back to those 2 1x1s that I was just talking about, it took us several field seasons to excavate those, because we were like, look, if we're gonna put all these artifacts in a box and study them later on, we want as much information from these as we possibly can. And so you might be able to dig 2 1x1s and find out as much as some people might dig a whole entire site, because we recorded every single aspect that we possibly can as we pulled those out of the ground. And so, I would put this up with any of the quarry sites. And what's amazing is just across the river is actually ground zero. We're kind of on the periphery of the quarries in this area on the South Carolina side. On the Georgia side, it is bonkers over there. There is rocks all over the place. Like, you can just drive down any dirt road over there and just drive across a formation. And it's modern quarries of people out there with crowbars prying Coastal Plains chert out of the rock for flint napping. It's crazy. So this is really we're the edge of chaos over here, so to speak.
Sounds like literal time travel. Those guys are like, rocking and rolling over there.
Yeah.
They're stone cold crazy. You get the idea, right? But swag right now, what strikes me about this entire area, Jason and I went and got lost in the woods today. We're walking down the road, and it was a bit like playing Legend of Zelda, or one of those classic NES games, because, we're traveling down a road in an unfamiliar land, and every now and then the road splits, and it's like, okay, let's take a right, see where this goes. And we travel a little ways, and then, okay, the road splits 2 more ways. Which way do we go this time? Somehow we managed to find our way back, but we had a real adventure today, you and I. And sporadically, as you travel along, you reach these areas where there are prolific distributions of flint, or chert as we would call it around here. Again, some say chert, some say flint, but I guess we would call this Allendale chert. And you see it, lots of it. And where you find it, the size of the flakes, the spread in a given area. It tells you so much. And at times we felt like detectives sneaking along and following clues, in the landscape that tell us things about the way of ancient life here. And again, I don't think I've ever been to a site where there is such a dynamic area. In a self-contained kind of system. Numerous sites, quarries, again, an entire habitat. We were talking at one point and saying, literally, they could mine the lithic material from the quarries up there on the hill. They bring it down here, they camp for the night, they flint nap, and then they hunt over there in the swamp and down by the river. This entire system is self-contained. They must have really liked living here a long time ago.
So I think it's definitely much more than just the rock here, because I think if you just map the distribution of archaeological sites, you would expect, if it was just about the rock, you would expect them to be piling up rock right on top of the quarry and really not doing anything else with it. What you end up finding is they're on all kinds of landforms that seem to be away from, not right on top of the quarry, but away in other interesting settings, like the bottom of Carolina Bay or up on a rim, or maybe next to an old Pleistocene pond or something like that, or an old oxbow of the Savannah River. So they're coming here. Well, one variable, and the variable we focus on, because most of what we have left behind are the stone tools, but they're clearly here for a whole bunch of other reasons. And so this is one of the few places where you actually have like the Hansel and Gretel trail of all kinds of artifacts, where you have a shot at getting kind of a landscape picture, because they've got all this land that we have access to, and people have been dropping rocks on it for a long time. So you said detective. I actually tell my mom I'm a prehistoric macroeconomist, which is a lot less sexy than saying a detective. So,
but still sexy.
That's all about the sexy.
The Big Short changed the game, man, for economists. So.
Paleo sexy.
Paleo sexy. Hey, new term. Bumper stickers.
Can somebody tweet that at me, please? Paleo sexy hashtag. Would you please?
T-shirts and bumper stickers. T-shirts and bumper stickers.
Ain't nobody got signal out here.
This is true, as we learned earlier today.
Yes, the hard way.
Being that we have the audience, and being that you are someone working in academia, you are an educator. There's a lot of people that listen to this podcast, and they have an interest in archaeology. They potentially have an interest in seeking a career in archaeology. So while we have you here, what are some things that people need to know if they are planning on pursuing a career in archaeology that they may not realize when they first get into this field?
Oh boy, there's like a laundry list.
And we have a whole audience here to attest to your answers,
which may or may not be extra credit if they pipe in, right? Actually, he's going to give you extra credit if you don't pipe in. So,
yeah, that's a good one. So, let's see.
Well, let's start with this. What do you think some of the misconceptions about archaeology are?
Oh man, there's like always the cliches like everybody talks about whenever they answer this question, like from Tomb Raider and Indiana Jones.
What are those?
The only time I've never had anybody shoot at me while doing archaeology. I had somebody threaten to shoot me at the biker bar here in town after doing archaeology, but not actually during archaeology. The reality is like I tell my students that like archaeology is like social science for athletes. It's part of it's really grueling, like doing field work, like especially for cultural resource management context. Like you're under time constraints. It's not always, you don't have a choice of, hey, I'm going to go around this briar patch. You have to go right through it. I did some CRM in the Southwest. That's where most of my CRM experiences was. And it was, okay, guess what? You better have some good shoes, some sunscreen, and a lot of water, because you're hiking through 120 degree weather. And you're going to find out real quick what a cholla is if you're not careful. And so, I mean, that part of it's hard. The other part of it is I think this is kind of like my view of one of the biggest misconceptions is actually you get a lot of people who are drawn to archaeology because of the stuff, and they're really zeroed in on the stuff. And it's not really, once you get into archaeology, like to me, it's not the stuff that's interesting. It's the data tables and what I can actually use that data to actually make some inferences.
It's kind of like an art aficionado being obsessed with the pencils and the paintbrushes instead of the actual paintings.
Right. And so I think or better yet, there's a really great quote that I make my students read Bob Kelly's The Fifth Beginning for Intro to Archaeology, because it's a good general audience book, and textbook sellers don't really have their finger. It's not like a textbook like thing. It's not designed to gouge students. It's designed just to be read by a general audience, which if you think about 18 to 22 year olds by and large at universities taking an intro to archaeology class, that's a general audience. And so it's like a really great book. And there's a quote, I think he attributes it to David Hurst Thomas. It's not what you find, it's what you find out. And I think that's really the fundamental core misconception about what it is that we do versus what we actually do is just summed up in that one quote.
Yeah. That's one hell of a quote. Add that, again, we were talking earlier about book lists, but, you got to put that on there. I think any book that's going to bring people to a broader awareness, because at the end of the day, archaeology, a subfield of anthropology, it's the study of who we are as people. When we're out there digging in the dirt, we're trying to understand something about ourselves and where we come from. What has swag taught you about that ancient lineage, that adventure that has been humankind?
Oh, man. So we're just starting on this. So this is just brand new, right? So we're still trying to figure out what exactly it is. So first off and foremost, we ended up finding last summer, I found a fluted preform, and then we got some OSL dates. And so we're pretty sure that what we got is a Clovis site. That's a Clovis site that's not in a place that we would ever have looked. There's this thing in archaeology, it's called the Teotihuacan effect. And it's the idea, if you're surveying the Valley of Mexico, what do you go record first? It's Teotihuacan. It's the biggest pyramid in the New World. And so if you were doing that version of that, if you were to come out here and say, okay, where am I going to go look for archaeological sites first? It would be right on top of the quarry. It might be right on like on the rim around the quarry. It wouldn't be in the bottom of what should be underwater in a Carolina Bay.
Right.
And so what that tells us is maybe there's some other variables here that we're not considering, because we're so focused on the stone tools.
What, by the way, that is really compelling. That was something we were talking about today while we were in the field, Jason. What do we make of what could have been, at least at some time, possibly during Clovis occupation periods, an underwater environment? What are we to make of these habitation sites that appear to be in a possible lake feature? How do you interpret that?
So there's two ways that we kind of look at this, and we're like, okay, one is this thing drained out before Clovis folks got there, and it's a little swamp. But it's a drained out swamp that went from a swamp to a little bog that may have been like a grassy kind of shallow, maybe just damp bog. Like maybe the time of year that they're there, there's not water standing in it at all. And so it's just an open spot that's good for flint napping. And the opposite of the other end of that extreme is one thing we noticed from just our awesome luck is, and also like everybody's kind of like, oh crap, what's going on? Is that coyotes out there?
Oh,
coyotes.
We've got coyotes in the distance.
Yeah,
I don't know if you can hear that on the microphone. We hear them. I heard them. Yeah. Oh, you can almost hear them. Wow. That's kind of eerie. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, it adds.
Just adds to the ambiance, ladies and gents.
So one of the things we noticed working out here is
the coyotes.
Yeah, the coyotes. We had some really kind of interesting weather luck the past few years. Usually it's like this, where it's like nice, you're in a t-shirt during the day, you're in a sweater at night. It's like, it's March, but it feels like early May. That's usually what it feels like out here. The last 2 years, it was like that the first day we got here. And then all of a sudden the weather turned and the bottom fell out of it, and it got really, really cold and windy.
And you figured out what it felt like here in the Pleistocene, didn't you?
Yeah, it was really cold. But what's interesting about swag, because you're down in that bowl, is you can hear the wind whipping above your head. You look up at the pine trees and you can just see it just nailing those pine trees, and it's still in the bottom of that Carolina Bay.
Something we pointed out too. It very well could have been that was a fairly sheltered environment. If you could find such a thing around here, and that might have been, appealing to him as well.
We also did a field school there in May that bled into June, and let me tell you, when it's the middle of June and you are in the bottom of that thing with about 20 sweaty undergrad and graduate students and TAs and professors, and you're looking up at the trees and you see the breeze, and it ain't happening for you down there in the hole. It kind of gives you maybe the opinion that this wasn't a summertime location to be hanging out, and that it was actually a nice sheltered location to be during the wintertime. And so we were thinking about that, and I was like, okay, what if this, the sediment down there that we're digging in the bowl part of swag, is really like this gray sediment. It's kind of like pond sediment. We're like, well, if you're here in the middle of the winter, what's that open place that would be a great place to flint nap that isn't in your house? It's probably in the middle of a frozen pond. So that's our fanciful idea, and I have no idea how we prove that, but we're gonna kind of work on that and see if we can't get at that.
So we have a very solidified paleo presence here with Topper being here on the same site. What else are we seeing as far as occupations? To what level are we seeing? Woodland? Are we seeing early archaic, mid archaic? What all has been represented so far at the swag site?
So, just next to us, there was. So I'll backtrack. So once we found swag, I was like, okay, it's geoarchaeology time. Every archaeological site, when you're excavating it, starts off as a spatial problem and a geoarchaeological problem. Where are your artifacts? How did they get there? And then what happened to them after that? And so I took off through the woods with a bucket auger and started kind of like trying to tease together some geomorphology. And I put in another bucket auger just not too far away from where we were digging, but it's a little higher up, and found a whole bunch of weathered flakes that were kind of deep, which is actually where we're digging right now. And the reason we're digging there is I'm like, this kind of looks like where the shoreline would be of a Carolina Bay. This is like a whole high and dry area. It kind of reminded me of like the work that my advisor at Arizona did with Paleo Lakes. I'm like, this is like a miniature Paleo Lake. This looks like a shoreline. And so I'm like, this looks like the beach to the shoreline. So what if we put in a 1x2 up here and just see what's there? And they pulled out like a early archaic side notched Taylor point, which is kind of where we're digging right now to kind of see what's going on there, because there was stuff that seemed to be coming out below that. So it's an interesting spot. We haven't actually found in the area where we're digging now. I think we've probably found thousands of flakes by now. 2 pieces of pottery that I recall, just 2. And that's kind of boggling to me that this is some place that was pretty cool and interesting during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. Then it stopped being interesting at all. I take that back, 3 pieces. So that's I don't know what's going on there or why that is or what that says about anything there, but I kind of think it was like that little area is cool in the early part, and then later folks just kind of abandon it for whatever reason.
I mean, there are some weird aspects about this site. We're talking with Dr. Shane Miller, assistant professor of anthropology at Mississippi State University. Again, with all the different considerations at a site like this, you're a teacher, you're in the field, you've got a group of grad students out here, and again, we, having overseen some of this operation earlier today, it's a well-oiled machine. You guys run quite an operation. What do you, Dr. Shane Miller, what do you learn after so many seasons spent out here? What do you learn when you're out here conducting these excavations?
About the actual doing of the excavation, or just in general?
What do you glean? It could be life experience, it could be anthropological, or it could be anything else, astronomical for that matter.
Astronomical.
Going deep.
I'm just trying to think outside the box here.
Oh man. So I guess one of the things Derek is usually out here with me. He couldn't come this time, and so we're like a dig team in a lot of ways. We're opposite personalities. We are like Jay and Silent Bob, and that I'm much more the Jay. He's much more the Silent Bob, we're just opposites. But one of the things that we've done over the years is we've continuously worked to try to get better and better and better at creating a system that's easy to learn but efficient at getting good data. And I feel like that's something that we're always figuring out new tricks here and there, new rules of thumb, new ways of teaching people. And then the thing that I'm always impressed by every time is how quickly people pick stuff up. For the most part, and clearly the grad students that I bring out, we have a total station and a data collector that we use to kind of get the data. The first day, I set up the total station, I had the data collector, and I was kind of working with one of my grad students, Jim Strawn, who's worked with me a lot, collecting the data. And then by the end of the day, by the end of the next day, we had trained up 2 other grad students, 3 other grad students, Nate Shores, Kara Larson, and Drea Lopez, and who are here, Mississippi State grad students. Mm-hmm. And by today, they were almost, they had it all. I was kind of unnecessary in a lot of ways.
Well, I don't know about that. You kept us company.
Yeah, busy entertaining us.
we have a GoPro. We have several GoPros that we use to take time lapse just for fun. And so those GoPros really contain the data that demonstrates that I just stood around a lot with my arms folded.
Talking to those two mouthy podcaster guys over there
like,
by the tree.
Who got lost in the woods
Easy
on
now.
their Zelda adventure.
we turned around at the enchanted swamp.
Yeah, with a pocket full of rupees and battled a dragon.
Yeah.
It's true.
Ganon got him.
Yeah, he got me.
Ganon the water moccasin got him.
Almost.
Yeah. Well, I limped out of there, but I survived.
The other thing that I want to add on to that is something that I've always appreciated. And going back to that initial question you asked me about Al Goodyear is how many people from all walks of life are just interested in archaeology and how fast they learn. Like just how quickly someone picks up doing archaeology. Like we've got volunteers here who've been coming out since like the early 90s who have been doing archaeology out here that have probably more like quality field experience than some PhDs. So let's just say, just for an example, we got a lady in the back. Her name's Judy Kendall. What was the first year that you came out here, Judy?
2001.
2001.
Wow.
Almost every year since 2001, she's been coming out for several weeks at a time to do field work. So, yeah.
See, that's the role of the avocationalist. People who are passionate and whose interest in this field drives their motivation to be a part of it. Which really, Jason, we
we understand that better than anybody. We do this, and you guys do this.
better than anyone but Judy.
Yeah. But Judy. Well, what I'm saying is we do this because we love it. And people who do archaeology do it because they care about it, and they do it because they're passionate about it. And what we saw here today, and we go to a lot of dig sites, and we interact with a lot of different people from all over the country. But this is as professional of an excavation as we've seen anywhere else. You guys work like clockwork out there today. Everybody's helping, everybody's working, everybody's involved, and top grade. Totally professional, and one of the best archaeology sites that we've visited, just in the fact that you all work so fluidly. So very impressed with what I saw out here today. Great group of people. Round of applause.
Yeah, please. Thank you, guys. Thank you for being wonderful hosts. We hope to come back for several subsequent dig seasons. Before we let you go, you've got a book available as well, right?
I do. It's Who Told You?
I just happen to do my homework.
We do research these things.
Yes.
It's called From Colonization to Domestication, and it's from the University of Utah Press. And it's like a big macroeconomic picture of how you go from hunting mammoths and mastodons, presumably during the end of the Ice Age, all the way to domesticating plants 10,000 years later. So I really look at it not necessarily from the plant side, like a bunch of my colleagues have done. If you want to read that side, I would recommend like Stephen Carmody and Natalie Moeller and Candy Hollenbach. They do really cool stuff. But I looked at it much more from the demographic side, like what was the population like in relation to environmental variables? So, was necessity the mother of invention or not?
I guess we find out if we read that book on Amazon. It's available?
Yeah, it is available on Amazon.
Excellent. Dr. Shane Miller, thank you for being our guest.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks again to Dr. Shane Miller and the fine folks at Mississippi State University who helped facilitate that interview. Jason, that was a lot of fun, doing a live interview with the grad students all sitting around and on the beautiful location of the plant property, with that being adjacent to some of our very favorite archaeological sites. One of my other favorite things about that experience, Jason, was all the exercise you and I got stomping around that property, walking the back roads and, the evident quarry locations all over that very large property. And you and I were able to examine, and actually, James, after you got there too, we found another one very close to the famous Topper site in Allendale County. A lot of quarry areas And a lot of people look at that and they just see those little kind of cut marks on the bank and everything. And they're like, cool, okay, whatever. No, folks. We're talking about thousands of years of indigenous population, people who had gone and they were digging because they were harvesting stone from those locations. You're seeing thousands of years of activity on those hillsides where soil has been removed, and these people are going in there and harvesting stone to use in lithic production. And it's kind of mind-numbing, actually, when you get down there and you are in the midst of all that and you see an environment. And as you and I were doing, Jason, when we walked the property the day before James arrived, we're trying to feel like, how this area would have looked during the ancient Paleoindian occupation. There was some conjecture that the area that we were in was actually a Carolina Bay. Now, my personal opinion, I'm not so sure after you and I walked the entire property and then looked at maps of it. I'm not convinced that that is a Carolina Bay, but it was a very unique area that we were in. That's for certain.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm certainly convinced of one thing is that I think that the surface has just barely been scratched on the massive amount of acreage that's in that region. I'm sure there's many, many more archaeological sites there that can be researched over the next probably 100 years by archaeology students in field schools. Fantastic site, just really amazing. And, being able to sit down in front of the live audience, to me, that was a lot of fun. It was a blast, actually. Having people gathered around as we were having these discussions, it just gave an energy. It gave a feel to the podcast that I think relayed very well through the interview. Shane, of course, was a great guy to talk to. He's much closer to our age. And a lot of times we're interviewing people much older than us. But, to have that relation with somebody who understands the same sort of, pop culture references and jokes and things like that. And Shane's just a great guy. We had a wonderful time out there. Met many grad students who were out there working, undergrad students as well, everybody from various universities. It was a great time to be had. We were able to camp there overnight. And everyone was just so giving of their time. Everyone was really interested in what Seven Ages was doing. And I just want to give a big thank you to everybody that we met out there. Many of you I am now Facebook friends with, and I look forward to communicating with you more. And I'm sure I will see you on some dig sites coming up here soon.
Absolutely. I had such a good time talking with Shane. And full disclosure, Jason, after you and I spent about an hour there on the site talking with Shane and just, cutting up, having fun. There's a great picture on our Instagram, by the way, I think of the three of us, you and he and I, the day before James arrived. And we're all just kind of chuckling. Somebody took a picture of us and sent it along. But, it was really a good time. Shane is one of the funnest guys, one of the most wonderfully warm hosts. The way that we were received when we arrived at the swag site, he was so kind. But when you and I walked away and got in the car, I also said to you, and you'll remember, I said, that is one of the smartest guys I've ever met. His knowledge of archaeology, not just of the Southeast, but all around. He is so well informed. He's obviously studied under some of the very best, and he is just, the perfect combination, in my opinion, of a very well informed, critically minded person, and also just a warm host. So again, thanks to Shane especially, and all the folks there who helped facilitate our time together with him in the field. Waldo, what did you learn while you were down there?
Well, first I learned that I'm sorry I missed that first night when you guys did the interview. It looked like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're right about there's so many other sites out there in that area that are are undiscovered. There's rock outcrops all over the place down there, which is really that's kind of the gift that keeps on giving for the for the native population. It's an unending resource for them. How great is that?
Oh, it's incredible, yeah. And I'm glad you were able to join us there as we were able to look at some of those quarry sites, because again, that's the great thing about having a field geologist. I often think about this. When we're out there in the field, it'd be one thing if we all just really liked archaeology, but I think that, avocationalists though we are, and I'd put Jason Pentrail up against any avocationalist archaeologist I've ever met. In fact, many of the grad students while we were on the trip were very impressed with Jason's knowledge too. That typically happens when we get out in the field. Now, I approach things, as you guys know, more from a historical research perspective. Also, I love archaeology and geology, but I don't have the depth of knowledge that you have, James. And so often, when I get out there in the field and we are studying stone and we're talking with people, it's so helpful to have that geologist there. And the moment he arrives on the site with us, there had been I don't know if you'd call it an anomalous little piece of stone, but something that wasn't readily identifiable. And the folks there at the site, when James walks up, they hand him this piece of stone and go, "Geologist, what is that?" And James, I think, was pretty quickly able to identify it. And again, the benefit of having a trained field geologist there with you, archaeology and geology go hand in hand. I learn as much about the ancient past through the geological lens of things, having guys like Waldo around, as I do from having people like Pentrail, Dr. Shane Miller, and others involved. So again, it's a cumulative process of inquiry that involves multidisciplinary approaches from various different areas of science that put together, over time, a beautiful assemblage about our ancient past. I love it. It's an adventure, and we will continue on as we always do. Jason Pentrail, James Waldo, let's pony up. It's just about time for last call.
Or first call in this case, since it's the middle of the day.
Well, then, guys, we've got a good day ahead of us, don't we? All right.
Oh, yeah.
Well, thanks again, as always, for being my cohorts and comrades. And to all of you out there who show support for our work, head over to 7ages.org. Check out all the fine things that we have for you to find out about. And, of course, as always, you will hear more about it on this podcast on future editions. James Waldo, Jason Pentrail, and yours truly, Micah Hanks. It is the 7 Ages Audio Journal.